Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Last time we talked about the fall of the Ancien regime and the collapse of the feudal French society that was built by Louis XIV. Today we're going to talk about what the revolutionaries are going to do now that they're in power. On August the 4th of 1789, the National Assembly tore down all of the pillars of French society, and so now they need to build all that stuff back up. And so we'll see what all that looks like, and then talk about some of the other set pieces of the French Revolution, like the Women's March on Versailles. So here's our basic goals for today. Take a minute and pause, and we'll dive in. So we're going to start with something called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. The Declaration of Rights of Man is a document written by the National Assembly to establish their sort of goals and vision for French society. The Declaration of Rights of Man lays out all the rights of French people, including liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, equal justice, and states that all men are born free and equal in rights. Here's a list of the rights laid out in the Declaration of Rights of Man. Take a moment, pause, answer the questions about this, and then we'll move on. But despite the lofty ideals in the Declaration of Rights of Man, the French revolutionaries start to divide on a whole bunch of different issues. For example, who should be allowed to vote in this new society? The same debate that the English had during the aftermath of their revolution. Should every Frenchman be able to vote, or should only property holders be able to vote? In France, this was the division between what they called active citizens who had property and passive citizens who did not. So, in the end, they decided that there should be active citizens, that they should choose the electors, and then those electors should choose the National Assembly to further isolate this National Assembly from the fickle whims of the people, quote unquote. There was also a massive debate over whether or not they should sell off church lands in order to pay their debts. And there was a debate about the rights of the king. Should he have veto power over what the National Assembly does? Should he just have a suspensive veto where he can just delay legislation but not stop it? And how much ability should the National Assembly have to override the king's veto? So this started dividing our National Assembly, and we start seeing the beginnings of the fracturing of the unity that we saw in the aftermath of the creation of the National Assembly in the first place. So we've got massive divides between these different groups. And in general, Louis did not help himself. Louis was very indecisive. He was waffling on whether or not to sign the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, and then, shockingly, he vetoed it and said he was not going to sign it, so it didn't become a law. He was still depending on, his troops, his Swiss guards, and not the National Guard that was established from the armed citizens of Paris for what I hope are obvious reasons. And there was this account that at a dinner party, Louis had offended the revolutionaries and trampled the red, white, and blue cockade into the ground, showing his disdain for all of the awesome progress the French people had made. And so all of this led to significant tension in Paris and anger at Louis specifically. Many people now questioning what his role should be in this new society at all. So a combination of all of those factors, plus a bread shortage, because as we had talked about yesterday, the French had a really, really bad harvest because of a hailstorm, and then a really brutal winter froze the rivers, and all of the flour mills stopped working. And so even when there was grain, they could not grind it into flour. And so the starving women of Paris decided to march on Versailles, where the National Assembly was meeting. They armed themselves and marched to go confront the king and demand solutions to his problems. The leader of the National Guard, a guy named the Marquis de Lafayette, who you may remember from our American history episode, then tried to mobilize the National Guard to stop them, but they decided to march after the women, supporting them, as opposed to fighting against them. And so now the people of Paris are marching to Versailles to confront the king and maybe the National Assembly and force them to do something. They burst into the National Assembly room and start screaming at people, and they burst into Versailles, killing the guards, surrounding the king and the queen, and threatening their lives. So pause and read about the murder of a number of people in the Palace of Versailles. And in the aftermath of this, Louis is forced to relocate from Versailles to Paris. So they shutter the royal residence. He's moved to the Tuileries Palace in Paris in order to be closer to his people, ostensibly, but more to keep him under close watch. Here he is wearing a Liberty cap with a cockade on it to show his support for the French Revolution. And when they move from Versailles back to Paris, the National Assemblymen, rather than organizing themselves by region, start organizing themselves by political belief, with the more radical people sitting on the left of the meeting hall and the more conservative people sitting on the right. This division into ideological seating arrangements is going to lead to increasing radicalization on both sides, as now there's less cooperation and common ground between the two groups. And so we're going to see their opinions about what should happen continue to diverge. Louis, of course, was not happy about this, so take a moment to pause and read his belief here. But the simple truth of it is Louis is now a virtual prisoner in Paris, and if he doesn't do what the mob wants, there's nothing to stop them from marching into the Tuileries Palace and killing him and his family. So now Louis is a veritable hostage of the French revolutionaries. Nobles in France start to freak the heck out. For example, both of Louis's brothers flee the country before they can be captured by revolutionaries. And so you start seeing clergy and nobles getting the heck out of France because they're somewhat concerned about what could happen to them. This becomes an increasing source of tension for the revolutionaries because they're worried that these exiled nobles are going to be a rallying point for resistance to the French Revolution, and that they're going to come back in at the head of a foreign army. The most feared was, of course, at the head of an Austrian army to attempt to put Louis back on the throne and undo all the awesome changes that the French people have made so far. So these émigrés are fleeing mostly for their own safety, but they become a constant sort of threat to the revolutionaries in Paris, which is going to become very, very important tomorrow. Here's an account of what an émigré saw as they were fleeing, and you can hopefully, in reading this, see why émigrés felt like they needed to get the heck out of France. So pause and read, and then let's move on. This division into two political parties becomes even more formalized as the National Assembly is meeting here. They're divided into, again, the Revolutionary Republicans, known as the Mountain, and the Girondins, who are not necessarily pro-monarchist, but are at least much, much less radical than the Mountain. So we start seeing these two political parties developing, with the Mountain advocating for universal male suffrage and maybe a republic and eliminating the king. And the Girondins arguing for, well, no, we need a constitutional republic like they're having in England. And so we get the division into these two political parties and increasing fighting. This is also where we get our left-right political parlance, with the idea that people on the left are radical or liberal and people on the right are conservative. This comes from the seating in the National Assembly. The most radical of the Mountain is a group called the Jacobin Club. It was originally created by a guy named Georges Danton, who is going to seize control of the government of Paris itself, not the National Assembly, mind, but the government of Paris. And you're going to have people like Maximilien Robespierre arguing for this. And the most radical of them, Jean-Paul Marat, here he is advocating potential violence against the king. He's going to have a newspaper called The Friend of the People, where he's going to start advocating for increasingly radical actions. You start to see Jacobin clubs be organized in other parts of France, and they start taking over elections. And so we start to see the rise of this radical group called the Jacobins that is the most, at this point, radical of the political party known as the Mountain. The king, freaked out about all this, decides that it's time for him to attempt to flee the country. And so, disguising himself as a groom, he hides in a carriage and very, very slowly makes his way out of France, hoping that no one will notice him. Unfortunately, as he's passing through a town right before he gets to Varennes, he is recognized because people see his profile and especially his very prominent nose, and they recognize him because his face was printed on all the money. And so he's stopped, they bow before him, and Louis basically says, yes, it's me, it's your king, stuff like that. And so they seize him, and he's escorted back to Paris under guard. This more or less makes everyone believe that Louis cannot be trusted and gives increasing strength to the Mountain in their calls for deposing Louis and eliminating the monarchy altogether. Here, we also get the fear of an Austrian invasion, because there was this worry that Louis was escaping to try to join up with his brothers and join Marie Antoinette's family in Austria, and that he is going to and that leads to increasing radicalization in Paris and increasing violence as the Mountain and especially the Jacobin Club start attacking anyone who is standing in the way of their agenda. The National Assembly doesn't really want to hold the king accountable for his flight, and so they pretend as if this was just some planned trip that he was taking and that he willingly chose to come back. And so they don't put the king on trial, which makes the radical mobs of Paris incredibly angry. They start advocating and protesting the fact that Louis is not being held accountable and is not being punished for his attempt to flee from his people. And so you see this massive demonstration on the Champ de Mars, where the National Guard comes out and they end up having to fire into the crowd to disperse them. And so now the National Assembly and the national government have fired on the people of Paris, and we start seeing an increasing divide between the National Assembly and the people, who are now calling for even more extreme actions to be taken. This rise of sort of the lower class street fighters of Paris, they become known as the sans-culottes. They're a group of mostly poor urban workers who support the Jacobin Club, and they're now willing to show up and enforce/push the Jacobin agenda. They start showing up to meetings of the National Assembly, jeering and catcalling and interrupting anyone they disagree with. And these mobs are increasingly willing to use violence in order to get their way. And so you get the rise of these urban street fighters, where the National Assembly, especially the conservative members, start worrying that if they don't go along with what the sans-culottes say, that the sans-culottes are going to show up at their house and murder them and their family. This is a defense of the sans-culottes, and you could see here a little bit, hopefully you could see why people who opposed the Mountain and the Jacobin Club specifically would be somewhat worried about them. So pause and take this in. Okay. And so what they decide is that after the massacre on the Champ de Mars, they decide that Louis cannot be trusted anymore. He cannot be in power. And so the National Assembly is going to be dissolved, and they're going to create a republic now with no king. The new version of the National Assembly is going to be renamed the Legislative Assembly, and Robespierre, our member of the Jacobin Club here, is going to propose that no member of the National Assembly could sit in the next Legislative Assembly. So they're going to have new elections all across France, and every member of the National Assembly is going to go home. And you're going to get a whole new group of representatives elected. And because of the organization of the Jacobin Club, this new Legislative Assembly is going to be much, much more radical than the previous National Assembly. And so we've now moved significantly towards the radical direction. And tomorrow we're going to talk about what all of that means. So that's the second phase of the French Revolution. They have now gotten rid of the king entirely. He's not dead yet. He's simply in jail. And the Legislative Assembly has replaced the National Assembly, and the Jacobins are now one of the key players in establishing policy going forward. So we'll talk about the implications of that tomorrow as we continue our story of the French Revolution. Thank you for listening.